Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. For most of my life, I have lived in a world made of watercolor. My severe myopia was not a diagnosis to me. It was simply the texture of my reality. The world beyond arm's length was a beautiful, impressionistic blur of soft colors and gentle, undefined shapes. Faces in a crowd were just shifting ovals of peach and pink. The leaves on a distant tree were a single, unified wash of green. I navigated my life not with sharpness, but with context, sound, and a deep reliance on the familiar. This soft focus world was not a prison. In fact, it was a sanctuary. The blur was a buffer between myself and the harsh, often overwhelming detail of the world. It granted me a kind of privacy, a permanent personal space. People's expressions were softened, their flaws blurred. The relentless, sharp edges of reality were sanded down into something more manageable, more poetic. I did not see the cracks in the pavement or the grime on the windows. I saw only the big picture. My glasses, the ones I had worn since I was a teenager, were a decade old, their prescription laughably out of date. They were a crutch, a tool that brought the immediate world into a slightly better, but still fundamentally soft focus. They allowed me to read, to work at my computer, as a librarian, to navigate my small apartment. But they never truly corrected anything. They were a compromise, and I had become comfortable with that compromise. My life was a quiet, orderly routine. I lived in a cozy apartment in a quiet part of the city. My work at the university library was a perfect fit for my worldview. It was a silent space, filled with the soft rustle of pages and the hushed whispers of students. I would move through the stacks, the spines of the books a blur of color, until I was close enough to read them. My world was a small, knowable, and gentle place. I never felt like I was missing out. What was there to see, really? More detail just seemed like more noise. My friends would sometimes comment on my old, scratched glasses, urging me to get a new pair. "Helen," they would say, "you're missing everything." But I never felt that way. I was not missing the world. I was just experiencing a different version of it, a softer, less demanding version. My blurry vision was a form of protective insulation. The decision to finally get a proper eye exam was a practical one, not a desire for change. My headaches had been getting worse, a sign that my eyes were straining too hard against my outdated prescription. And my job required more and more screen time, my old lenses making the text on the computer swim after a few hours. It was a matter of professional necessity. It was time for a correction. The optometrist was a kind, professional man who seemed quietly horrified by the strength of my prescription. He clicked through various lenses, each one bringing the letters on the eye chart into a slightly sharper focus. "Goodness," he murmured as he made his final adjustments. "We're going to have to special order these lenses. It will be like seeing a whole new world for you." I smiled, a little excited, a little nervous. The week I spent waiting for my new glasses was filled with a strange anticipation. What would this new world look like? Would it be beautiful? Or would it be harsh, overwhelming, filled with a level of detail my brain was not equipped to handle? I had lived for so long in my soft, blurry sanctuary that the thought of it being invaded by high-definition reality was both thrilling and terrifying. On the day I went to pick them up, I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. The optician, a cheerful young woman, fitted the new, stylish frames to my face. The lenses were thick and powerful. "Okay," she said, her voice full of a practiced enthusiasm. "Ready to see the world?" I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and then opened them again. The world exploded. The blur was gone, replaced by a level of detail so intense, so overwhelming, that it made me gasp. Every single tiny thing was rendered with a razor-sharp, almost painful clarity. I could see the individual fibers in the carpet, the pores on, the optician's nose, the tiny scratches on the metal frame of a picture on the far wall. It was not a new world. It was the same world, but a version of it I had never even known existed. I stumbled out of the optometrist's office and onto the busy street, and the world rushed at me with a violent, breathtaking clarity. The faces of the people passing by were no longer soft, anonymous ovals. They were detailed maps of lines, wrinkles, and expressions. The bricks on the buildings across the street were not just a reddish-brown wash of color. They were individual, textured rectangles, each with its own unique chips and imperfections. It was too much information. My brain, so accustomed to the soft blur, felt overwhelmed, assaulted by detail. My walk home was a disorienting, almost psychedelic experience. I was seeing my own neighborhood for the very first time. I saw the intricate peeling paint on a fire hydrant I had passed 1,000 times. I saw the names of manufacturers on the hubcaps of passing cars. I saw the individual leaves on the oak trees, each one a distinct, sharp-edged shape, trembling in the breeze. The world was a place of astonishing, terrifying detail. I had to stop, several times leaning against a wall just to let my brain catch up, to process the fire hose of new visual information. My old world had been a world of shapes and colors. This new world was a world of edges, of textures, of lines. It was sharp. It was aggressive. A part of me, the part that had been so comfortable in the blur, wanted to take the glasses off, to retreat back into my soft, impressionistic sanctuary. But another part of me was thrilled. It was a dizzying, exhilarating feeling. I was seeing the truth. The world was not a soft, gentle watercolor. It was a high-resolution photograph, and I was finally seeing it as it was meant to be seen. The initial sensory overload, the feeling of being visually assaulted, was slowly being replaced by a sense of wonder. I was a blind person who had been given sight, and the world was a miracle. When I finally reached my own apartment, it too was a foreign country. I saw the fine layer of dust on top of my bookshelf that I had never noticed before. I saw the small hairline crack in the plaster near my ceiling. I saw the intricate woven pattern of my own favorite armchair, my own home, my most familiar. Space was suddenly filled with a million new details, a million new secrets that had been hidden from me by my own eyes. I spent that first evening just looking at things. I would pick up an old coffee mug and stare at the tiny crazing in the glaze. I would look at the spines of my books and read the titles from across the room, a feat that had been impossible just that morning. I was a tourist in my own life, discovering the details of a world I had inhabited, but had never truly seen. The feeling was one of profound, almost spiritual revelation. The headaches I had been suffering from for months began to recede almost instantly. The constant, low-level strain of my eyes trying to make sense of a blurry world was gone. I could feel my facial muscles, which I hadn't even realized were perpetually tensed, finally begin to relax. The physical relief was immense. My new glasses were not just a tool, they were a cure. That night, I stood at my window and looked out at the city. Before, it had been a beautiful, blurry tapestry of distant lights. Now I could see the individual windows of the buildings across the way. I could see the headlights of individual cars moving on the streets below. The world was sharp, clear, and vast. I felt a surge of power, of clarity. I was no longer detached from the world. I was a part of it, a sharp-eyed observer of its every detail. My old life, the life of the soft focus world, now seemed like a kind of prison. I had believed it was a sanctuary, a protection from the harshness of reality. But I now saw that it had been a cage, a limitation. I had been living in a dream, and now, for the first time, I was awake. The world was more complex, more detailed, more real than I had ever imagined, and I was ready to see all of it. I went to bed that night, feeling a profound sense of excitement for the future. I was about to rediscover the entire world, one sharp, clear detail at a time. I was blissfully unaware that some details are left blurry for a reason. I believed my new vision was a gift, but I was about to learn that it was also a curse, because I was now able to see the things that had always been there, hiding in the blur, waiting patiently to be seen. The first few days with my new vision were a constant series of small, startling revelations. The world was a library of fine print I had never been able to read. I spent my lunch breaks not eating, but just sitting on a park bench, looking at things. I saw the intricate, iridescent wings of a dragonfly, the detailed pattern of the bark on a tree, the tired, smiling wrinkles on the faces of elderly couples walking by. The world was a masterpiece, and I had been looking at it through a smudged, cloudy glass. My commute to and from the library, a walk I had taken thousands of times, was now a journey through a foreign country. Every building facade, every street, sign, every shop window was a new discovery. The familiar path was now layered with a million details I had never known existed. It was exhilarating, but also deeply disorienting. My brain, so accustomed to filtering the world into broad, soft shapes, was now working overtime to process the relentless flood of sharp, new information. It was on the third day of my new sight that I first began to notice the symbols. It was a small detail, easily missed by someone who was not, like me, actively trying to see everything for the first time. It was scratched into the base of a metal lamppost, a small, intricate little sigil about the size of a coin. It was a circle, with a single vertical line running through it, and 3 small dots arranged in a triangle at the top. My first thought was that it was just a strange piece of graffiti, the tag of a local artist or a gang. It was the kind of visual noise that cities are full of, the kind of detail that my old vision would have rendered completely invisible. I found it odd, but I didn't give it a second thought. It was just another new, sharp object in my new, sharp world. I noted it with a passing curiosity and continued on my way home, my mind already moving on to the next new discovery. But the next day, I saw another one. This time, it was scratched into the side of a green metal mailbox a few blocks. Further down my route, it was the same symbol. The circle, the line, the 3 dots. Seeing it a second time was a strange coincidence. It seemed this particular artist or gang was quite prolific in my neighborhood. I felt a small flicker of unease, a sense of a pattern emerging where there should have been only randomness. I started to look for them. My walk home became a treasure hunt for these strange, recurring symbols. And once I started looking, I saw them everywhere. Scratched into a park bench. Drawn in permanent marker on the back of a no parking sign. Etched into a small, grimy patch of concrete on the sidewalk. They were all along my usual route home, a trail of secret breadcrumbs that had been invisible to me my entire life. My rational mind immediately began to work on an explanation. It was a public works marker, perhaps, a symbol used by the city to denote a gas line or a water pipe. Or it was a game, a kind of urban geocaching that I didn't know about. It had to be something mundane. It was a strange, repeating detail in my newly visible world, but it was not a sinister one. It was just another layer of the city's complex, hidden language that I was now able to read. But there were other things too. Other details that my new, sharp vision was revealing. With my glasses on, I could now see clearly into the windows of the apartment buildings across the street from my own. Before, they had just been blurry squares of yellow light at night. Now I could see the details of other people's lives. A woman watching television, a couple having dinner, a man standing in his window looking out. These glimpses into other lives were a new and strangely intimate experience. I felt like a voyeur, an accidental peeping Tom. I tried not to look for too long, to respect their privacy, but it was hard not to. The clarity was so new, so intoxicating. I was a person who had spent her life in a room with frosted glass, and now suddenly, all the glass was clear. It was hard not to stare at the new world I could finally see. Most of the faces in the windows were just as fleeting as the ones on the train had once been. They were brief snapshots of life, there one moment and gone the next. But just as with the symbols, my brain, so attuned to patterns, began to notice a recurring detail. In a high window of the building directly opposite mine, a window that had always just been a dark, indistinct square, I started to notice a shape, a human shape, a figure, standing in the darkness of its own room, just looking out. I would see the figure there most evenings when I came home from work. It was always in the same window, on the top floor of the old brick building across the street. It was just a silhouette, a man-shaped patch of darkness against the unlit room behind it. My logical mind told me it was probably just a mannequin, or a strange piece of furniture whose shape was distorted by the glass. It was a quirk of my new, sharp vision, another strange detail of a world I was still learning to see. The symbols, too, continued to appear. They were my new companions on my walk home, a secret, cryptic alphabet that was written on the skin of my neighborhood. I started to photograph them with my phone, collecting them as if they were rare butterflies. I told myself it was just a strange new hobby, a way of engaging with the details I had missed for so long. But a small part of me knew it was something else, a desperate attempt to gather data on a phenomenon I didn't understand. For a week, these two new details of my life remained separate in my mind. On one hand, there were the strange, recurring symbols scratched into the world around me. On the other, there was the silent, motionless figure in the distant window. They were two separate, unrelated points of strangeness in my new, high-definition reality. Two new quirks of a world that was proving to be much, much weirder than my old, blurry one. The connection came one afternoon when I was walking home from work. I was on the opposite side of the street from my own apartment building, the side where the figure lived. As I passed his old brick building, I happened to glance up, and I saw, with a jolt of pure, cold shock, that one of the strange, circular symbols had been crudely scratched into the peeling paint of the windowsill of his apartment, the window where he always stood. The two separate data points the symbols and the figure, suddenly, violently, merged into one. They were not unrelated. They were connected. The man in the window was somehow tied to the strange, cryptic alphabet that was scattered along my path. My carefully constructed wall of rationalization began to crumble. This was not a coincidence. This was not a game. This was something else. This was a pattern. A deliberate and deeply unsettling pattern. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the symbol on his windowsill, my heart pounding. The figure was not there at the window now, but his sign was. It was a marker, a claim of territory. The symbols were not just random graffiti. They were his. They were a sign of his presence, his passage through the world, and they were all along the path that I, and only I, walked every single day. I tried to force the fear down. I tried to find a new, more elaborate rationalization. Perhaps he was the one drawing the symbols. A strange, lonely artist, marking his territory, and he also happened to enjoy standing in his window. The explanation was weak, pathetic, a flimsy shield against a growing, terrifying realization. But it was the only thing I had. I clung to it. That night, I looked out my window at his building. His window was dark, empty, but now I knew what the symbol on his sill meant. It was a signpost. It was a declaration. It was as if he had hung a nameplate on his door, a nameplate written in a language that only he, and now I, could understand. The watcher in the window was the author of the symbols, and I was the one who was following his trail. My new world, my sharp, clear, beautiful world, was beginning to feel menacing. The details were no longer just interesting, they were threatening. The clarity was no longer a gift, it was a curse. It was allowing me to see a pattern, a story, that had been there all along, hidden from me in the safe, soft, protective blur of my own poor vision. My old world had been a sanctuary of ignorance. And as I stood there, looking out at the dark window across the street, a new and more terrifying thought began to form. Had he always been there? The figure in the window. Had he been standing there for years? A blurry, indistinct shape that I had never truly seen, never truly registered. And had my new glasses, my correction, simply brought him into focus for the first time? The thought was a cold, sharp, and terrifying one. The connection between the symbol and the man in the window was a turning point. My world, which had just recently snapped into a sharp, clear focus, now had a soft, blurry undercurrent of dread. I could no longer see the symbols as random graffiti. I could no longer see the figure as a simple, curious neighbor. They were two parts of a single, unsettling equation, and I was the unfortunate variable that connected them. My daily walk home was no longer a journey of discovery. It was a journey through enemy territory. My focus now shifted entirely to him, the man in the window. He was no longer just a background detail. He was the main subject of my new, terrifyingly clear world. I started to actively look for him, not just in his window, but everywhere. On my way to work, I would scan the distant rooftops, the far-off street corners, the crowds of people waiting for a bus. I was searching for the still, silent figure I now knew was watching me, and I would find him. Not every day, but often enough to establish a horrifying pattern. He was always at a great distance, a still shape on a park bench on the far side of the green, a motionless figure at the end of a long, straight street, a man standing on an overpass, looking down at the traffic, He was always just on the edge of my new, expanded sight line, a silent, patient sentinel at the borders of my world. With my new glasses, he was a person. I could make out the details. He was tall, thin, and always wore a long, dark coat, no matter the weather. His posture was unnervingly still, his form rigid, like a statue. I could never see his face clearly. The distance was always too great for that level of detail. But I could see his shape, his form, his undeniable human presence. He was a real man, and he was watching me. But the truly terrifying part was the duality of it. My new glasses had revealed him, but my old vision still held the power to hide him. I began to perform a strange, masochistic experiment. When I would see his distant, sharp figure, I would take my glasses off, and in an instant, the world would dissolve back into its familiar, soft focus state, and he would dissolve with it. The sharp, menacing figure would simply become a vague, indistinct blur, a meaningless shape that posed no threat. This became my new, horrifying ritual. I would see him, crisp and clear, a source of profound terror. And then, I would take my glasses off, and he would vanish, replaced by a harmless, blurry shape that had likely been there for years. A shape I had seen 1,000 times, and had never given a second thought to. My disability, my lifelong myopia, had been a shield, a protective veil that had kept the monster hidden in plain sight. The world now had 2 layers. There was the safe world, the blurry, impressionistic world of my unaided vision, the world I had lived in my entire life. And then there was the real world, the sharp, high-definition world revealed by my glasses, a world that contained a silent, watching man who was a fixed, menacing point in my daily geography. And I could switch between these 2 worlds at will, simply by removing my glasses. This constant shifting between realities began to take a psychological toll. Which world was real? The safe, blurry one I had always known? Or the new, sharp one, with its terrifying hidden details? My glasses, which had at first felt like a tool of liberation, now felt like a key that unlocked a secret, more dangerous dimension that was layered on top of my own. And I was the only one who could see it. I found myself taking my glasses off more and more often when I was outside. The overwhelming detail of the world had become a source of anxiety, because I knew that within that detail, he was somewhere, watching. The blur was a comfort again. It was a way to make him disappear, to pretend he wasn't there. I was willingly retreating back into my old prison, because the prison felt safer than the new, sharp world I had been so excited to enter. But I could not live in the blur forever. I needed to see to work, to read, to function. And every time I put my glasses back on, the world would snap back into its terrifying high-definition focus. And he would be there, waiting, at the end of the street, on the park bench. A distant, silent, and patient figure. His presence a constant, unwavering reminder that my new, clear vision had come at a terrible, terrible price. My life became a bizarre game of hide-and-seek, where I was both the seeker and the one who was hiding. I would put on my glasses to navigate the world, my eyes scanning the horizon, my mind bracing for the appearance of his sharp, distant silhouette. And when I saw him, a jolt of terror and a strange, sick sense of validation would run through me. Then I would snatch the glasses from my face, and he would be gone, vanquished back into the safe, blurry world of my past. The most terrifying part was that he never did anything. He just stood there, motionless, watching. His inaction was a form of psychological torture far more effective than any overt threat could have been. A man who yells, who follows, who attacks, that is a man you can report, a threat you can define. But a man who simply stands, a quarter of a mile away, perfectly still, he is just a man. The threat was entirely in his gaze, a thing I could not prove. I began to doubt my own perceptions. Was it the same man every time? Or was I now so primed for fear that my brain was simply imposing his shape onto any distant, solitary figure I saw? The world is full of people standing alone, waiting for a bus, for a friend, or just lost in thought. Was I just weaving a narrative of persecution out of the mundane, random tapestry of city life? The glasses had given me sight, but had they taken my sanity? This self-doubt was a constant, gnawing companion. I felt trapped between two terrifying possibilities. Either a silent, patient man was stalking me from a distance, or my own mind was betraying me, creating a phantom out of my newfound, overwhelming visual reality. I didn't know which possibility was worse. To be hunted by a real monster, or to be the monster myself, the architect of my own fear. I had to know for sure. I had to get a better look. I needed to see his face, to confirm if it was the same man every time. The distance was always too great. My new glasses powerful but not telescopic. My mind formulated a new, desperate plan, another escalation in my private war against the man or against my own mind. I decided I would bring my own tool of long-distance observation to the fight. I would bring my father's old bird-watching binoculars. It was a reckless idea. It meant acknowledging the game, not just to myself, but to him. To stand on a street corner and aim a pair of binoculars at a distant figure was not a normal act. It was an act of confrontation. It was a declaration that I knew he was there, that I was watching him back. It would be a profound shift in our silent, one-sided relationship. But I had to know. The uncertainty was eating me alive. The next day, the old heavy binoculars were a comforting weight in my work bag. All day I was distracted, my mind not on my books or my patrons, but on the confrontation to come. I was no longer just a passive observer, switching between worlds of blur and clarity. I was about to become an active participant. I was about to try and bring him into focus, to turn my own clarifying gaze back upon my tormentor. As I left work, that evening, the city felt like an arena. The tall buildings were the stands, the streets the field of play, and somewhere in the stands, my opponent was waiting, watching. I felt a strange mixture of terror and a kind of grim, exhilarating power. The helplessness was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. I was not just a victim anymore. I was an investigator, on my way to get a closer look at the evidence. I walked my usual route, my hand clenching the strap of my bag, the binoculars a heavy, solid promise within. I saw him almost immediately. He was at the far end of the main avenue, a tall, thin, dark shape standing perfectly still against the backdrop of the setting sun. He was a quarter of a mile away, a familiar, menacing silhouette. But today, that distance would be erased. Today, I would see his face. I stopped at the corner, my heart pounding. I found a spot next to a large concrete planter, a small piece of cover. My hands trembled as I pulled the heavy binoculars from my bag. This was it. The moment of truth. I was about to bridge the distance, to violate the very space that had been his greatest weapon. I raised the binoculars to my new, sharp eyes and I focused on the distant, waiting figure. The world through the binoculars was a shaky, magnified circle. I fumbled with the focus dial, my trembling hands making the image swim and blur. For a moment, all I saw was a distorted, unrecognizable landscape of concrete and glass. Then, as I steadied my grip and found the right focus, the distant figure snapped into a sudden, horrifying clarity. It was as if I had teleported across the 4 city blocks that separated us. He was right there. He was a man in his late 50s, perhaps older. His face was thin and gaunt, his skin pale, almost translucent. He wore a simple, dark, and slightly shabby overcoat, even though the autumn afternoon was mild. His hair was thin and gray. There was nothing overtly monstrous about him. He was just a man. A sad, tired-looking man, standing alone on a street corner. But then I saw his eyes, and my blood ran cold. They were fixed. They were not scanning the crowd, not looking at the traffic, not staring off into space. They were aimed directly down the avenue, a pair of dark, unblinking points of focus in his pale, still face. And they were aimed directly at me. There was no doubt, no ambiguity. He was not looking at my building, or at someone near me. Through the powerful, clarifying lenses of the binoculars, I could see his gaze, and it was locked onto mine. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. This was the confirmation I had been seeking, the truth I had been so terrified to find. He was real. He was watching me. And he knew that I was watching him. Our strange, distant, one-sided relationship had just become a two-way street. The observer was being observed, and the intensity of his unwavering, silent gaze was a physical force that seemed to travel across the distance and press down on me. I felt a sudden, profound sense of being known. This was not the vacant stare of a stranger. This was a gaze of intense, focused familiarity. It was the look of someone who has been studying a subject for a very, very long time. He had been watching me, not for weeks, but for months, for years. He had been there all along, a blurry, indistinct shape in my old world. And my new glasses had simply given me the terrible, unwanted ability to finally see his eyes. I lowered the binoculars, my arm suddenly feeling heavy, weak. I leaned against the concrete planter, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The city around me, with its noise and its traffic, seemed to fade away into an insignificant, distant roar. My entire universe had shrunk to 2 points. Myself and the man at the far end of the street, whose gaze was a physical tether, a line of invisible energy that connected us across the vast urban landscape. The violation was absolute. My anonymity, my shield of being just another face in the crowd, was gone. He had singled me out. He had chosen me. And for how long? How many years had he been standing at his window, a blurry shape watching my blurry shape? How many times had he been that distant, still figure on the street, his presence completely unnoticed by my weak, unprotected eyes? My own disability had been my only defense, and I had cured it. I risked another brief look through the binoculars. He had not moved. He was still standing there, his gaze still locked on my position. He was not reacting to my observation of him. He was simply continuing his own. It was as if my looking back was an expected, inevitable part of the process. My discovery of him was not an unforeseen complication. It was the next phase of his game, a phase he had been patiently waiting for me to initiate. This knowledge was a new and more profound kind of terror. He was not just a stalker. He was an orchestrator. He had been waiting for me to gain the ability to see him. The thought was insane, impossible, but it felt terrifyingly true. The symbols, the watching, it was all a breadcrumb trail, a path he had laid out for me, a path he knew I would only be able to see once my vision had been corrected. He had been leading me to this moment. I dropped the binoculars. They hit the pavement with a loud, clattering crash, but I barely registered the sound. I turned and fled, my body acting on a pure, primal instinct for escape. I ran into the crowd, my shoulder bumping against strangers, my mind a screaming chaos of fear. He had seen me. He knew that I had seen him. And the silent, one-sided game of observation was now, officially, over. A new, more terrifying game was about to begin. The confrontation with his unwavering gaze broke me. For 2 days, I called in sick to work, unable to face the journey, unable to face the possibility of seeing him again. I stayed in my apartment, the blinds drawn, my new powerful glasses sitting on the counter like a cursed object. I would pick them up, put them on, and the world would snap into its terrifying high-definition clarity. Then I would snatch them off, retreating back into the safe, soft blur of my uncorrected vision. My home was no longer a sanctuary. Every window was a vulnerability. I would stare at the blurry shape of the building across the street, knowing that he was in one of those windows, a sharp, clear figure in his own world, looking back at my blurry, indistinct one. The knowledge that he could see me with a clarity that I could only achieve with my glasses was a new and profound form of violation. He owned the world of details, and I was just one of those details. But on the 3rd day, the fear began to give way to a grim, steely resolve. I would not be a prisoner in my own home. I would not sacrifice my job, my life, to this silent, distant phantom. He had power over me because he knew my routine, my patterns. He knew my path. So, I would change the path. I would erase the map he had so carefully drawn of my life, and I would draw a new one, a map he could not possibly predict. That evening, I did not go straight home from work. Instead, I pulled out a city map and began to chart a new course. My old route was a straight, efficient line from the library to my apartment. My new route would be a labyrinth, a deliberately inefficient, convoluted series of side streets, back alleys, and unfamiliar avenues. It would add 20 minutes to my commute, but it was a price I was more than willing to pay for my own peace of mind. The next day was the first test of my new strategy. As I left the library, my heart was pounding with a nervous, anxious energy. I did not walk down my usual street. I turned left instead of right, plunging into a part of the city I barely knew. Every step was a conscious act of defiance, a deliberate break from the routine that had become my cage. I was taking control. I was making myself unpredictable. I walked with my head on a swivel, my bespectacled eyes scanning every distant rooftop, every street corner, every faraway park bench. I was a spy in enemy territory, constantly searching for the man who was hunting me. The new neighborhood was unfamiliar, a landscape of strange buildings and unknown faces. The lack of familiarity was both disorienting and, in a strange way, comforting. He could not know this path. This was my territory now, I felt a flicker of my old self returning, the logical, data-driven librarian. I was treating my stalker like a problem to be solved. The variable was my root. By changing the variable, I was hoping to change the outcome. It was a simple, logical experiment. If he appeared on this new, random route, then I would know that his surveillance was something more, something that was not tied to a simple line of sight. But if he did not, then I had won. The walk was tense, every distant, solitary figure a potential threat. I saw a man waiting for a bus, a construction worker on his break, a teenager leaning against a wall. My mind, now primed for paranoia, tried to turn each one of them into him, but I forced myself to be rational. I looked for the details, the height, the thinness, the dark overcoat. None of them matched. They were just people, normal, everyday, anonymous people. I made it all the way to my apartment building without a single confirmed sighting. Not once did I see his familiar, still silhouette in the distance. The relief was a slow, cautious dawn breaking through the long night of my fear. It was working. My simple, logical plan was actually working. He was a creature of habit, of observation, and I had simply removed myself from his field of observation. It was that easy. As I unlocked my front door, I felt a surge of triumphant, heady relief. I had faced my fear. I had analyzed the threat, and I had implemented a successful countermeasure. I was not a helpless victim. I was a strategist. I had outsmarted him. The terror of the past few weeks began to recede, replaced by a renewed sense of confidence, of power. I had taken back my life. I had taken back my walk home. I was safe again. For the rest of the week, I stuck to my new labyrinthine path. Each day was a successful repeat of the first. I would walk home, my eyes scanning the distant horizons, and each day I would be met with nothing but the normal, mundane landscape of the city. The man in the dark coat, my silent, distant observer, was gone. He had vanished from my world as completely as if he had never existed at all. My strategy had been a resounding success. With each passing day, the knot of fear in my stomach unwound. A little more. My paranoia began to feel like a memory of a past illness, a fever that had finally broken. I started to see the world clearly again, not as a hunting ground, but as a place of interesting, non-threatening details. The strange symbols I had once obsessed over now just seemed like odd, meaningless graffiti again. I had stripped them of their power over me. I began to feel a little foolish for the depths of my terror. I had let a strange man's weird habit of standing still and staring into the distance completely unravel my life. He was probably just a lonely, strange person, and my sudden appearance in his field of vision had been a momentary curiosity for him. Now that I was no longer on his path, he had likely forgotten all about me, his attention having drifted to some other new detail in his world. My new route, which had at first been a path of anxiety, now became a journey of quiet discovery. I found a small, charming bakery I never knew existed. I discovered a quiet little park with a beautiful fountain. I was reclaiming the joy of my daily walk, the simple pleasure of moving through the city. I had not just escaped a threat, I had improved my own life in the process. The feeling was one of profound, empowering victory. My glasses no longer felt like a curse. I reveled in the sharp, clear details of the world again. I had faced the dark side of my new vision, the terrifying things it had revealed, and I had come out the other side stronger. I had proven that I was in control, not just of my route, but of my own perception. I would not let the strange details, of the world frighten me. I would simply observe them, categorize them, and move on. I still saw my home as a sanctuary, but it was no longer a fortress against a siege. It was just my home again, a place of comfort, of peace, of my own making. I no longer felt the need to keep the blinds drawn. I let the afternoon light stream in, filling my apartment with a warm, cheerful glow. The darkness had been banished, not just from my home, but from my mind. I was safe. The memory of his unwavering gaze, the thing that had so terrified me, was losing its power. It was just a memory, a snapshot of a strange encounter. It had no hold on me anymore. I had broken the connection by simply walking away, by refusing to be a part of his strange, silent game. It was a powerful lesson in my own agency. I had the power to simply say no and walk a different path. My confidence was fully restored. I was no longer a victim. I was a problem solver. A woman who, when faced with a strange and unsettling situation, had used logic and reason to neutralize the threat. I had been smart, I had been proactive, and I had been successful. The world was once again a predictable, understandable place, governed by the laws of cause and effect. But my victory was built on a foundation of profound arrogance. I had assumed that his surveillance was limited by my own line of sight, that his world was as small as mine. I believed that by changing my path, I had become invisible to him. I had treated him like a simple predator, one who could be outsmarted by simply avoiding his known hunting grounds. I had failed to understand the nature of his patience. He had seen me change my route. He had watched me walk my new, convoluted path. And he had let me. He had given me a full week of peace, a week to build up my confidence, to believe I had won. He was not a simple predator. He was a teacher. And he was about to give me a new, terrifying lesson. That it did not matter which path I took, because he was not just watching the path. He was watching the destination. My week of peace had been a potent antidote to the poison of my fear. I began to feel normal again, my world restored to its proper, logical proportions. The man in the coat was just a strange memory, a story I would perhaps one day tell with a laugh. My new route home was a permanent fixture now, a pleasant, winding journey that I had come to genuinely enjoy. I was safe. I was in control. The correction had been a success. It was on a Tuesday, nearly 2 weeks after the binocular incident, that he reappeared. I was walking down a narrow side street on my new route, admiring the architecture, when I felt it. The familiar, cold prickle on the back of my neck. The instinctual feeling of being watched. I slowly lifted my head, my eyes scanning the distant end of the street. And there he was. A tall, thin, motionless figure in a dark overcoat, standing a quarter of a mile away. My blood ran cold. The carefully constructed piece of the last week shattered into a million pieces. He was here, on my new route, on this quiet, obscure side, street that he should have no reason to be on. It was not a coincidence. It was an impossibility. He had found me. He had learned my new pattern just as he had learned my old one, and he had reappeared. A silent, patient predator who could not be shaken. I froze on the sidewalk, my grocery bag suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. He just stood there, his stillness a profound and terrifying contrast to the bustling living city around us. He was a statue of menace, a fixed point of horror in my world. I didn't need the binoculars this time. I knew that his gaze, even from this great distance, was fixed directly on me. He was letting me know that my escape had been a temporary, permitted illusion. I turned and fled, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back. I plunged into the nearest subway station, my mind a screaming chaos. My clever plan, my labyrinthine route. It had been a joke to him. He had not been thwarted. He had simply been observing, patiently waiting for me to establish a new routine that he could then, in turn, colonize with his silent, terrifying presence. My sense of control was a complete and utter fraud. The journey home was a blur of paranoid terror. Every person on the train was a potential suspect. Every reflection in the dark window showed his gaunt, pale face. He was no longer just a distant figure. He was an idea, a virus that had infected my mind, and I could not escape it. He had proven that no matter which path I took, he would be standing at the end of it, waiting for me. When I finally reached my apartment building, I felt a sense of profound, hopeless dread. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was just the place where I slept. It was the end of the line, the final destination that he was always, ultimately, watching. The locks on my door felt like flimsy, pathetic things against a man who could track my movements across an entire city with such effortless precision. As I climbed the stairs to my third-floor apartment, my legs feeling heavy and weak, I was already bracing myself. I knew this was not the end of his message. The sighting had been the first part, the re-establishment of his presence. But there would be more. He was an artist of escalation, and he was about to deliver his next, more personal, more terrifying piece of work. I knew something would be waiting for me. I reached my apartment door, and I saw it immediately. It was sitting directly in the center of my doormat, a small, dark object that did not belong there. It was placed with a deliberate, almost reverent care. My breath caught in my throat. This was a new kind of violation. He had not just followed me with his eyes. He had come to my home. He had stood on my doorstep. He had left me a gift. I knelt, my hand trembling, and looked closer. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was carved from a dark, smooth wood, its wings slightly outstretched, its form simple but elegant, and I recognized it instantly. It was a perfect, three-dimensional replica of the strange, cryptic symbols I had been seeing scratched into the lampposts and the signs all over my neighborhood. The symbol was his, and now, a piece of it was mine. I picked up the wooden bird, my fingers closing around the smooth, cool wood. It was heavier than it looked, solid and dense. The craftsmanship was stunning, every line and curve carved with a patient, obsessive precision. This was not a whim. This was the work of hours, of a focused, dedicated, and deeply disturbed mind. He had not just left me a note. He had left me a piece of his art, a piece of his obsession. This was the ultimate confirmation. The man in the distance, the watcher on the street corner, was the same person who had been carving these strange symbols all over my neighborhood. The path I had been following was his. He had been marking his territory, and his territory was my life, my daily routine. And now, he had brought a piece of that territory to my very doorstep, a final, undeniable claiming of my space. I quickly unlocked my door and scrambled inside, the small wooden bird clutched in my hand. I felt a desperate need to get it out of the public hallway, to hide the evidence of his visit. But once inside, it felt like I had willingly brought a cursed object into my sanctuary. It sat on my kitchen counter, a small, dark, and menacing idol, a physical manifestation of his presence that had finally breached the walls of my home. He knew where I lived. The thought was a drumbeat of terror in my mind. He had followed me home at some point, had learned my address, my apartment number. And he had been here, just outside my door, while I was at work, while I was blissfully unaware. He had knelt on my doormat in my personal space and had placed this object here for me to find. The thought of his proximity, of his quiet, deliberate movement so close to my own home, was sickening. My defenses were a joke. My clever, convoluted new route had done nothing to deter him. It had only been a new map for him to learn, a new path for him to mark with his strange, cryptic signs. I had thought I was being unpredictable, but to him, my movements were just a new data set to be analyzed. He was always one step ahead, his patience and his reach far greater than I could have ever imagined. The carved bird was a message of intimacy. It was a gift, a token from his world to mine. He was no longer content to just watch from a distance. He was now seeking a more personal, more direct form of communication. He was showing me that he could bridge the distance between us whenever he wanted. He was showing me that the line separating his world from mine was becoming thinner every day. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of high alert paranoia. I checked the locks on my doors and windows a dozen times. I peered through my peephole every time I heard a noise in the hallway. My home, my last bastion of safety, now felt like a fragile, permeable container, a place he could touch, could leave things at, whenever he pleased. The Watcher was no longer distant. He was at my door. The psychological game had escalated dramatically. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was now an active participant in my life, an unseen tenant, who left strange, handcrafted sculptures on my doorstep. He was not just trying to scare me. He was trying to build a relationship with me, a one-sided, terrifying relationship built on a foundation of surveillance and intimidation. I held the small bird in my hand. It was a beautiful, terrible object. It was a symbol of his obsession, of his talent, of his madness, and it was a promise that this was not the end, a promise that the gifts would continue, a promise that he would continue to get closer, to breach my defenses, to insinuate himself deeper and deeper into my life, until there was no space left that he had not touched. And as I sat there, in my locked apartment, I finally understood the true nature of the terror. It was not just that I was being watched. It was that the Watcher was now demanding to be seen. He was leaving me pieces of himself, forcing me to acknowledge his presence, his reality. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like a death sentence, that it was only a matter of time before he decided that leaving a gift was no longer enough. The small wooden bird sat on my coffee table, a dark, silent testament to my new reality. For days I circled it, my mind a whirlwind of fear and indecision. The sight of him on my new route had been terrifying, but this was different. This was a physical object, a piece of his world deliberately placed into mine. The barrier between observation and interaction had been crossed. He had been to my home. The knowledge was a constant low-grade fever in my blood. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. My previous attempts to explain my fear had failed because my evidence was ephemeral. a glance, a feeling. But this was different. I had the bird. It was a tangible piece of proof, a thing I could hold in my hand and show to someone. I decided I had to try one more time to make someone understand, to make someone believe. My sanity felt like it was hanging in the balance. I called my friend Sarah, the same friend I had confided in before. I didn't want to, knowing her previous skepticism, but she was the only one who knew even a fraction of the story. I asked her to come over, my voice on the phone tight with a forced calmness I did not feel. I told her I needed to show her something. She agreed, her own voice filled with a cautious, worried concern that already felt like a judgment. She arrived that evening, her face a mask of gentle sympathy. I didn't waste time with small talk. I simply led her to my coffee table and pointed at the small carved bird. "This was on my doormat yesterday evening," I said, my voice quiet and flat. "He left it for me. It's a perfect copy of the symbols I told you about, the ones I've been seeing all over the neighborhood." I watched her face, praying for a flicker of belief. She picked up the bird, turning it over in her hands. "It's beautifully made," she admitted, her thumb running over the smooth wood. "But Helen, how can you be sure he left it? You live in an apartment building. It could have been a neighbor's child, a prank, anything. You can't just assume that every strange thing that happens is connected to this man you saw from a distance." She was already building a wall of rationality, brick by painstaking brick. "It's not a coincidence, Sarah," I insisted, my voice gaining a desperate edge I hated. "He appeared on my new route, a route no one knew, and then this shows up on my doorstep hours later. He is following me. He knows where I live. This is his way of telling me that." I could hear how it sounded, the frantic, paranoid logic of it. But it was the truth. Sarah placed the bird back on the table and looked at me, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful pity. "Or," she said, her voice soft and therapeutic, "you saw a man who looked like the man you saw before, and then you found a random object, and your mind, which is already in a state of high anxiety, created a connection between the two. You're looking for a pattern, so you're finding one, even if it's not really there." She was talking about confirmation bias, about paranoia, about the unreliability of a mind under stress. She was using the calm, logical language of psychology to dismantle my reality, to explain away my terror. In her world, a world of sense and reason, my story was a textbook case of anxiety manifesting as a persecutory delusion. The carved bird was not evidence of a crime. It was evidence of my illness. "I am not sick," I whispered, the words feeling thin and weak even to my own ears. "I am being stalked." She just shook her head slowly, her expression one of profound sadness. "I think you need help, Helen," she said. "Not from the police. I think you need to talk to a professional. The new glasses, the stress of the world suddenly being so sharp. It's a lot to handle. It's no wonder you're feeling anxious and seeing threats that aren't there." Her words were the final nail in the coffin of my hope. She had taken my proof, my one tangible object, and had turned it into a symbol of my own instability. I had come to her for validation, and she had given me a diagnosis. I realized then that my story was a cage. The more I tried to explain it, the more I tried to convince someone of its truth, the more insane I sounded, and the more tightly the bars of their disbelief closed in around me. I didn't argue anymore. There was no point. The more I insisted on my reality, the more convinced she became of my delusion. I just nodded, a quiet, defeated gesture, and walked her to the door. She gave me a long, tight hug, the kind you give someone you believe is suffering deeply. "Please think about what I said, Helen," she whispered. "I'm just worried about you." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in my apartment with my terrifying truth and her loving, suffocating pity. I picked up the carved bird from the coffee table. It was no longer just a threat from him. It was now a symbol of my own isolation. It was the object that had proven, beyond any doubt, that my reality was a story no one would ever believe. I was the anxious witness. My testimony was too strange, too personal, too unbelievable to be accepted by the sane, rational world. I was on my own. The thought of calling the police was now a bitter joke. I could imagine the conversation, the weary, condescending tone of the officer on the other end of the line. "So, a man you've seen from a quarter-mile away left a small, wooden bird on your doormat?" My story was not evidence. It was an anecdote, a curiosity. I had no crime to report, only a feeling of profound, gut-wrenching terror. And terror is not against the law. He had created the perfect form of harassment, one that was completely invisible to everyone but its intended target. He left no fingerprints. He made no direct threats. He committed no provable crimes. He simply watched, and he left his strange, symbolic art. He was a ghost, and the entire world was his accomplice. Their skepticism and rationality, the very walls of the prison he had built for me. I was alone with my monster. My world had shrunk to the size of my small apartment, but even this space was not safe. He had been to my doorstep. He knew where I lived. The distance he had so carefully maintained was a choice, not a limitation. He could close that distance whenever he wished. The thought was a constant, low-level hum of terror in the back of my mind. Every creak in the hallway, every footstep on the stairs, could be him. I began to feel a strange, perverse connection to him, the only other person who knew the truth of my situation. He was the author of my nightmare, and I was his sole reader. We were the only two members of a secret club, bound together by his obsession and my fear. The thought was sickening, but it was also the only true relationship I had left. Everyone else was on the outside, looking in with pity and confusion. Stopped trying to fight it. I stopped trying to find a rational explanation. I accepted the terrifying, impossible reality of my situation. I was being haunted by a man who could see me from a great distance, who knew my routines, and who could leave me small, handcrafted warnings at my door. My life was no longer my own. It was a shared space, and he was my silent, unseen roommate. This acceptance was not peace. It was a resignation. It was the quiet, weary despair of a prisoner who has finally stopped rattling the bars of their cage. I retreated into myself, into the quiet, constant vigilance that was now my life. I went to work. I came home. I existed. But I was always watching, always listening, always waiting for his next move. The game was his to control. But he was about to show me that the game I thought we were playing was just a prelude. His distant observation, his cryptic gifts, they were just the opening act. He had successfully isolated me, had severed my connections to the world of belief and support. He had prepared the stage perfectly, and now he was ready for the main performance. He was ready to show me what his true power was, because his greatest trick was not the distance he kept. It was the distance I thought he kept. I believed he was a man far away, a figure on a distant horizon. But I was about to learn in the most direct and horrifying way imaginable, that my own eyes had been lying to me from the very beginning. He was not far away at all. In fact, he had been close, enough to touch me this whole time. My life settled into a strange, grim rhythm. I would go to work, my glasses a necessary evil that allowed me to function, my eyes scanning the distant horizons for his familiar, still shape. And then I would come home, take the glasses off, and retreat into the safe, soft, blurry world of my apartment. My own vision had become my only sanctuary, a buffer of impressionistic colors and shapes that kept the sharp, terrifying details of my new reality at bay. He was always out there. Not every day, but most. A distant figure on a rooftop, a still shape at the end of a long street. I no longer tried to change my route. There was no point. He was not tied to a path. He was tied to me. I learned to live with his presence, a constant, low-level thrum of fear in the background of my life. He was a feature of my landscape now, as permanent and as menacing as the storm clouds that gathered on the horizon. I stopped documenting his appearances. My logbook of symbols and sightings lay abandoned in a drawer. What was the point? I was the only one who would ever read it, the only one who would ever believe it. To continue writing it felt like an indulgence in my own madness. It was better to just accept it, to endure it. I was a prisoner, and my daily commute was a walk around the prison yard, always under the watchful eye of the silent, distant guard. The city, which I had once loved to explore, was now a source of constant anxiety. The new, sharp clarity my glasses provided was a curse. Every detail was a potential threat. Every distant figure a potential monster. I found myself hurrying from place to place, my gaze fixed on the pavement in front of me, trying not to look up, trying not to see the things that I knew were waiting to be seen. The beautiful, high-definition world was a minefield. One afternoon, the weather turned. A cold, damp rain began to fall, blurring the edges of the city. The sky was a uniform, gloomy gray. I left the library with my collar turned up, my head bent against the drizzle. The rain was a welcome sensory distraction, its soft, steady patter a comforting sound against the silence of my own fear. For a little while, the world felt normal. Just a woman walking home in the rain. The rain was a fine mist that clung to everything, including the lenses of my glasses. The sharp, clear world began to soften, its edges bleeding into one another as the tiny droplets of water accumulated on the glass. The streetlights became blurry halos, the faces of other pedestrians indistinct shapes. It was like my old world was slowly reasserting itself, a temporary, welcome reprieve from the tyranny of high definition. I stopped under the awning of a closed shop, fumbling in my bag for the small microfiber cloth I used to clean my glasses. The world was a mess of blurry running colors, and I needed to be able to see clearly to navigate the wet, slippery sidewalks. It was a simple, mundane act, the kind I had performed 1,000 times in my life, even with my old, weaker glasses. A simple correction to bring the world back into focus. I pulled the glasses from my face, and the world dissolved. In an instant, the sharp, rain-slick details were gone, replaced by the profound, familiar, and deeply comforting blur of my own unaided vision. Everything beyond a few feet was a soft, gentle wash of color and light. The buildings were gray smudges. The streetlights were soft, glowing orbs. The other people on the street were just moving shapes. This was my world, my safe world. For a single beautiful second, I felt a sense of peace, of homecoming. This was the reality I had known for my entire life, a soft, gentle, and fundamentally safe place, a world without sharp edges, without threatening details, without distant, watching men. I held the glasses in my hand, the cool rain on my face, and I remembered what it was like to feel safe in the blur. But the moment of peace shattered, because as I stood there, in my soft focus sanctuary, I noticed something was wrong. The world was a blur, yes. Every building, every car, every person, all of it was an indistinct, gentle shape, except for one thing. One thing in the sea of blurs was perfectly, impossibly, and horrifyingly sharp and clear. It was the figure of a man, and he was standing 3 feet in front of me. It was him, the same thin, gaunt man from my binoculars, but he was not a quarter of a mile away. He was close enough to touch. I could see the raindrops clinging to the dark wool of his overcoat. I could see the deep, tired lines around his hollow, empty eyes. And I could see that his unwavering, possessive gaze was fixed directly on me. He was rendered in the same impossible, high-definition clarity as my corrected vision, a sharp, terrible island in my blurry world. My mind shattered. The reality of what I was seeing was a paradox, a violation of the very laws of optics. My myopia was a physical, medical fact. Things that were far away were blurry. Things that were close were clearer. But he was close, and the world around him was a blur. Yet he was perfectly, terrifyingly sharp. He was not a part of my world. He was an overlay, a separate layer of reality that did not obey the same rules. He did not speak. He did not move. He just stood there, on the wet pavement, a few feet from me, and he watched me. His expression was one of quiet, profound patience. It was the look of a teacher waiting for a particularly slow student to finally understand the lesson. And the lesson was this. The distance had been a lie. He had never been far away. He had been here, this close, all along. My own eyes, my own disability, had been my shield. My myopia had been a protective filter, a gauzy curtain that had kept him at a safe, blurry distance. It had rendered him a harmless, indistinct shape. The glasses, my correction, had not shown me where he was. They had only shown me where he appeared to be. They had translated his proximity into a false distance, a trick of the light, a lie my brain could accept. In a single, horrifying moment of clarity, it all made sense. The way he was always perfectly still, the way he could appear on any route I took. He was not a master of surveillance following me from afar. He was my shadow. A silent, constant companion who was always just outside my own limited field of sharp vision. He was always there, in the blur, just a few feet away, waiting to be seen. My hand, the one holding my glasses, moved with a frantic, instinctual speed. I jammed them back onto my face. The world snapped back into its painfully sharp, high-definition focus. The buildings, the streetlights, the faces of distant strangers. It was all there, perfectly clear. But the space 3 feet in front of me, the space where he had been standing, was now completely, utterly empty. He was gone. The sharp world had erased him. I screamed. A raw, ragged, tearing sound of a mind that has been completely, irrevocably broken. I ran blindly through the rain, my new glasses instantly fogging over, blurring the world once more. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that spot, from the place where the two worlds, the blurry and the sharp, had finally, terrifyingly, converged and revealed their horrifying secret. I finally made it back to my apartment, a soaked, shivering, hysterical mess. I locked the door, but I knew it was useless. The locks, the walls, the distance, it was all a fiction. He was not a man who could be kept out. He was a presence that could choose when and how he was seen. He was a law of physics that applied only to himself. My home was not a sanctuary. Nowhere was a sanctuary. The second act of my nightmare was over. He had proven his absolute power, his complete mastery over my perception of reality. He was not a stalker in the conventional sense. He was something else, something older, something that operated on a set of rules I could not comprehend. He had shown me that my greatest weakness was not my fear, but my own two eyes, and that my only protection had been my own disability. Huddled on my floor, the glasses lying on the table across the room, I was afraid to put them on, terrified of the sharp, menacing world they would reveal. But I was more terrified of taking them off, of dissolving the world into a blur, not knowing if he would be standing right next to me, sharp and clear, when I did. I was trapped, not in my apartment, but in my own perception. And he was the ghost who could walk between my worlds at will. The aftermath of the encounter on the street was a quiet, suffocating paralysis. I did not go to work. I did not answer my phone. I sat in my apartment, my new glasses on the coffee table, a forbidden object I dared not touch. I lived in the blurry world, the safe world, but it was no longer safe. The knowledge that he could be standing, sharp and clear just a few feet away, had poisoned the blur forever. The blur was no longer a shield. It was just a veil that hid the monster. My reality was a prison of two equal and opposite terrors. With my glasses off, the world was a soft, indistinct fog where he could be standing right next to me, invisible until he chose to be seen. With my glasses on, the world was a sharp, clear landscape where I could see him a quarter of a mile away. A constant, distant sentinel, there was no escape. He controlled both the blur and the focus. He controlled my entire perception of reality. For days, I was trapped in this state of helpless inertia. But my mind, my librarian's mind, the part of me that craves order and information, began to fight back. The fear was a powerful, paralyzing force, but my need to understand, to categorize, to find an answer, was stronger. I could not live in a world that did not obey the laws of physics. If the laws were different, then I needed to learn the new ones. My terror, which had been a form of passive suffering, began to transform into an active, obsessive curiosity. Who was he? What was he? A ghost? A demon? A figment of my own fractured sanity? Or something else entirely? The questions were a lifeline, something to hold on to in the sea of my fear. My helplessness began to recede, replaced by the grim, determined focus of a researcher tackling an impossible problem. I would not run. I would not hide. I would investigate. I had one single tangible thread to pull on in this entire surreal nightmare. The symbols, the strange carved bird he had left on my doorstep, and the identical symbols that were scratched into the lampposts and windowsills of my world. They were a clue. They were a piece of data. And data was something I knew how to work with. I took the small carved bird from the drawer where I had hidden it. I had been afraid to touch it, but now I looked at it with a new, analytical eye. It was not just a symbol of my terror. It was a key. It was a piece of his world that he had given to me, and I would use it to unlock the door to his. I took dozens of high-resolution photos of it from every conceivable angle, documenting its every line and curve. My apartment became a research station. My laptop, once a tool for my job, was now my only weapon. I uploaded the photos of the symbol. I started with simple image searches, which yielded nothing. I then moved on to more obscure databases, symbology websites, forums on forgotten languages, digital archives of folk art and local history. I was a librarian again, but the library I was searching was the vast, dark, and chaotic one of the internet. My search was a descent into a rabbit hole of esoteric knowledge. I spent hours, then days, sifting through ancient alphabets, alchemical, symbols, and obscure religious iconography. Most of it was a dead end, but I was relentless. I was driven by a new, powerful purpose. I was not just trying to save my life, I was trying to save my reality. I had to find a rational explanation for the irrational things that were happening to me. After 3 days of obsessive, sleepless searching, I found it. It was not on a mainstream website. It was in a scanned, digitized copy of an old, out-of-print book I found in a university's digital archive. The book was a collection of local urban legends and ghost stories from my own city, compiled by a folklorist in the 1960s. And in a chapter on local bogeymen, I saw it. A crude, hand-drawn sketch of the symbol. The circle, the line, the 3 dots. My heart pounded in my chest. I had found it. It had a name. It had a history. I was not the first person to see it. I frantically began to read the accompanying text. The old typewritten words a revelation, a confirmation that I was not crazy. The book described an old obscure piece of city folklore, a story told to frighten children. It was the story of a creature known as the man who isn't there. The legend was vague, pieced together from hearsay and campfire stories, but its details were so specific, so eerily familiar, that I felt a cold dread wash over me. It described a being that haunts the periphery of human perception. He is a shape in the corner of your eye, a blur in the distance, a figure in a crowd that you can feel but never quite see. He is the man who is always there, but who isn't there when you turn to look directly at him. According to the old forgotten stories, most people live their entire lives with him as a harmless, unnoticed blur on the edge of their world. They are protected by their own inattention, by the natural way the human brain filters out unnecessary information. Most people never truly see him, but the legend claimed that he is drawn to a certain kind of person, a certain kind of sight. He is drawn to the watchers, to the observers, and he is drawn to those whose perception of the world suddenly, dramatically changes. The book described it in chilling, poetic terms. It said, "He preys on those whose vision has been suddenly and unnaturally corrected. He is a creature that feeds on clarity. When a person who has lived their life in a blur is suddenly given the gift of sharp, perfect sight, that sudden, jarring shift in perception acts as a beacon, a lighthouse in the fog that calls him out of the periphery and into sharp, terrifying focus." My new glasses were not just a tool. They were a trigger. They were a dinner bell. I had not just started seeing him because my vision was better. He had started hunting me because my vision was better. My newfound clarity had made me visible to him. I was not the observer who had found him. I was the specimen that had suddenly, brightly, lit up under his microscope. The entire ordeal had not been his choice. It had been mine. The legend went on. It said that once he has chosen a subject, he begins his correction of their world. He leaves his symbols, his mark, as a way of testing their new sight, of seeing if they are truly paying attention. He appears at a distance, a still figure, waiting to be noticed, waiting for the subject to acknowledge his presence. The entire game, the entire haunting, was a response to my own newfound ability to see. I felt a wave of nausea. My beautiful, clear new world was a curse. My desire for a normal life, for the simple ability to see clearly, had inadvertently invited this ancient perceptual parasite into my existence. He was not a man in the normal sense. He was a being that existed, on the very edge of sight, a creature that lived in the space between the blur and the focus, and my glasses had given him a bridge into my world. The book offered no solutions, no ways to fight him. It was a collection of stories, of warnings, not a manual of defense. It described how his chosen subjects would become isolated, how their stories would be dismissed as madness by those who still lived in the normal world of perception. It was a perfect description of my own experience, written 50 years before I was born. My modern, unique horror was an ancient, recurring nightmare. I now understood the terrifying truth of my situation. I was not being stalked by a man. I was being haunted by a concept, by a sentient wrinkle in the fabric of perception. His ability to be sharp when the rest of the world was blurry was not a violation of physics. It was the very nature of his existence. He was the one thing that was always in focus, a terrible, unwavering point of clarity in a world of comfortable, protective blurs. The revelation was partial, but it was devastating. I knew what he was, in a strange, folkloric sense, but I still didn't know what he wanted, what his endgame was. Was it just to watch? To terrorize? Or did the correction lead to something worse? The old book did not say. It only spoke of the victims becoming more and more isolated, until they too simply faded into the background, becoming another blurry, forgotten shape. I closed my laptop. The image of the old typewritten pages burned into my mind. I had my answer, and the answer was worse than any I could have imagined. My enemy was not a man I could fight, or a ghost I could exorcise. He was a fundamental law of my new, sharp-sighted world. And as long as I continued to wear my glasses, as long as I continued to see the world with this unnatural clarity, I would belong to him. The knowledge from the old book was a poison, but it was also a key. I finally understood the rules of the game, the terrible arcane logic of my haunting. He was drawn to the clarity. The glasses were a beacon, a lighthouse calling to a ship made of shadows. My world was sharp, and so he was sharp within it. The thought was terrifying, but it also contained the faintest glimmer of a solution, a desperate, final move in a game I was losing. If the glasses were the beacon, then I had to extinguish the light. If the clarity was the curse, then I had to embrace the blur. The idea was a profound and sorrowful one. To willingly surrender the beautiful, detailed world I had only just discovered, to retreat back into my soft focus prison. It felt like a kind of death. But to continue living under his unwavering, inescapable gaze was a kind of hell. I had to choose the lesser of two terrors, My decision was made. I would get rid of the glasses. I would destroy them, and with them, the bridge that connected his world to mine. But not yet. Not before one last look. I felt a strange, compelling need to face him one more time. Not as a frightened victim, but as a person who now understood the rules. I would not let him think he had simply driven me back into the darkness. I would show him that I was choosing it. I waited until nightfall. I put on my glasses, the world snapping into its familiar, menacing clarity. I walked out of my apartment and onto the city streets, but I was not walking my usual route. I was heading downtown, towards the old commercial district, a place of large, dark, plate glass windows that would be perfect mirrors in the darkness. I was choosing the location of our final, silent confrontation. The walk was a final tour of the world I was about to give up. I looked at the intricate details of the architecture, the distant glow of the city skyline, the faces of the strangers I passed, all with a new, poignant sadness. I was a tourist, saying goodbye to a country I had only just begun to explore. The clarity was so beautiful, so full of information, and I was about to sacrifice it all for my own peace of mind. I found the perfect spot. A large, darkened storefront of a department store that had long since gone out of business. The massive pane of glass was like a black still lake, perfectly reflecting the streetlights and the passing cars. I stood across the street from it, my back to the window, and I waited. I scanned the distant street corners, the rooftops, the alleyways, searching for his familiar still silhouette. He was there. Of course, he was there. He was standing at the far end of the street, under a buzzing streetlight, a tall, thin, and patient figure. He was watching me. He had followed me here. Or perhaps he had simply known where I would be. It didn't matter. He was here for our final appointment. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. This was it, the end of the game. I did not use the binoculars this time. I did not need them. I just stood there, my glasses on my face, and I stared back at him across the long, empty street. I let him see me looking. I let him know that I was aware, that I was a willing participant in this final, silent standoff. We were two observers, locked in a battle of perception, a duel of unwavering gazes. For a long time, nothing happened. We just stood there, two still figures in a sleeping city. But then, I began my final move. I did not run. I did not scream. I did not look away. I simply, slowly, reached up and took the glasses from my face. It was a deliberate, almost ceremonial gesture, an act of surrender, an act of defiance. I was forfeiting the game. I was choosing to be blind again. As the glasses left my face, the world dissolved. The sharp, clear city street, the distant streetlights, his own menacing silhouette. It all melted away into a beautiful, familiar, and profoundly peaceful blur. He was gone. The monster had been vanquished. I had found the solution. I had blinded myself to make him disappear. I held the glasses in my hand, a symbol of the terrible clarity I was now rejecting forever. A profound sense of peace, a quiet I had not felt since the day I first put the glasses on, washed over me. I had found the answer. It was so simple, so elegant. His power over me was entirely dependent on my own perception. He was a creature of clarity, and I had just plunged his world into a soft, impenetrable fog. I had blinded him by blinding myself. I stood there, in my safe, blurry world, And for the first time in weeks, I felt truly, completely alone. I smiled. It was a real, genuine smile of pure, unadulterated relief. I looked down at the glasses in my hand, the source of all my terror. They were a beautiful, terrible object, a key to a world I was never meant to see. And I knew I could never risk putting them on again. With a sense of grim final purpose, I walked to a nearby storm drain, knelt, and placed the glasses on the hard metal grate. Then I brought my heel down with all my strength. The sound of the lenses cracking, of the frame snapping, was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. I smashed them again and again, until they were nothing but a pile of twisted plastic and shattered, useless glass. I kicked the remains into the storm drain, sending them down into the darkness, back to the world of unseen things where they belonged. The bridge was broken. The connection was severed. The game was over. I had won. I live in the blur again. I have embraced my old world, my soft focus sanctuary. I have a new pair of glasses, but they are a copy of my old, weak prescription. They allow me to function, to read, to work, but they keep the world at a safe, gentle distance. The harsh, overwhelming detail of high-definition reality is a country I have no desire to ever visit again. I have chosen my prison, and it is a comfortable, peaceful one. The memory of the man, of the symbols, of the unwavering gaze has begun to fade. I tell myself it was a strange temporary madness, a side effect of my brain being unable to cope with the sudden shock of true sight. A long, protracted, and terrifying optical illusion. It is the only explanation that allows me to sleep at night, to walk down the street without my heart pounding in my chest. It was a story I told myself. It wasn't real. I am happy now, in my quiet, impressionistic world. The faces of strangers are once again soft, anonymous ovals. The distant trees are once again gentle washes of green. The world is no longer a place of sharp edges and menacing details. It is a soft, beautiful watercolor painting again. I have returned to my sanctuary. I am safe. The correction has been, in its own way, corrected. But sometimes, when the light is just right, or when I am particularly tired, I feel a flicker of the old fear. A shape in the distance will seem for a moment a little too still, a little too focused. But I have learned to ignore it. I have learned to trust the blur. The blur is my friend. The blur is my shield. It is the wall I have built between myself and the things that are too terrible to be seen clearly. Last night I was in my apartment, looking out the window. The city lights were a beautiful, familiar, blurry constellation. I could see my own reflection in the dark glass, a soft, indistinct shape against the backdrop of the city's gentle glow. It was a peaceful, quiet moment, a testament to the new, safe life I had built for myself. I was finally at peace. But as I looked at my own blurry reflection, I noticed something else. Behind me, in the reflection, was another shape. It was not blurry. It was perfectly, impossibly, and horrifyingly sharp and clear. It was the figure of the man in the dark overcoat, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He was standing right behind me, in my own living room, and I finally understood. The glasses had not shown me him. They had only shown me his distant, harmless reflection. I had been looking in the wrong direction all along. He was not a creature of the sharp, clear world. He was a creature of the blur, and my myopia, my lifelong disability, was not my shield. It was the very thing that allowed him to get close. He had always been right behind me.